Now, the other major revolution during this time period that we should talk about is the French Revolution, right? So France is going to incur massive debt from supporting the American Revolution, right? I just mentioned how the American victory was made possible in a large part because France supported it. The French government had trouble paying these debts, in part because it had a terrible, what we call a regressive tax structure. So I need to explain what I mean by that. In the United States today, we have an income tax, and it is a progressive income tax. And the idea is that the more money you make, the higher percentage you have to pay in taxes. And the logic is you're benefiting more from the government, you're benefiting more from society, so you owe more to it. So, and I'm just making up numbers. In a progressive tax structure like we have in the United States, again, I'm just making up numbers. Let's say you make $100,000, the government takes 10%. If you make $200,000, the government takes 20%. If you make $500,000, the government takes 30%. Right? It makes sense, right? A person with making $100,000 a year can survive losing 10% of it. It's not going to hurt them too much. On the other hand, the government, if you're only making $30,000 a year, the government may only tax you 2%. And if you're making less than that, they may tax you nothing. The idea is that people who are wealthy are benefiting from the system, and they can better afford to pay without it really hurting them. And especially once you start making, hundreds of thousands of dollars, paying more in taxes does not really significantly affect your lifestyle. Whereas on the other hand, if you're only making $20,000 or $30,000, it does. An extra few $100s here and there makes a big difference. That's how we do things in the United States in a progressive tax structure. France did things completely differently. France had a regressive tax structure. The people who paid the most taxes in France were the peasants. The people who paid the least were the high nobles and certain church officials. Sometimes people say they paid nothing, and some did pay nothing, but they sometimes paid a token amount. But the key thing is, you had a serious economic contradiction in France. The poorest people paid the most taxes. So the people less able to pay had the burden of paying. That is a serious issue. It also means that your government doesn't have much money, right? You can't get blood from a stone. So in order to try and reform this system, King Louis XVI, the grandson of King Louis XIV, will call the Estates General in 1788. What is the Estates General? It is the French Parliament. It had not been called for over 100 years, but Louis thought in order to solve France's economic problems, caused in part by the inability to pay the debt from supporting the American Revolution, he had to get a parliament together that could bring in economic reforms that would allow France to tax the people who were most able to pay it. The problem is that because they had gone so long without any kind of real reform, remember, they didn't have a democracy, so it made it difficult to communicate, and the king could just do whatever he wanted. All that pressure built up, and that frustration of the government not reforming in the past is going to lead not to reform, but to a revolution. Now, the first part of the French Revolution just got rid of divine right and royal absolutism. The first part of the French Revolution made King Louis XVI a constitutional monarch, similar to what they had in Britain. So whereas before Louis XVI was theoretically had absolutism, he could do whatever he wanted because he had divine right from the king, or from God rather. Now, in the first part of the French Revolution, he becomes a constitutional monarch whose power fundamentally comes from the people and who's responsible to the people and to the law. That's the first part of the French Revolution. But that first part of the French Revolution does not last. And one thing that makes the French Revolution different from the American Revolution is that whereas the American Revolution was primarily political, it was not social, it was not economic, the French Revolution will try and remake the whole of society according to the principles of liberty, meaning freedom, equality, meaning everyone's equal, and fraternity, meaning everyone should be unified. And based on this, they will go even further and will go from a constitutional monarchy to a republic. The King of France will actually be overthrown completely and stop being king, and they will move to a republic. And in 1792, the National Convention for the Constitution will actually pass a law supporting universal male suffrage, meaning all men, regardless of property, are going to get the right to vote. So already we can see that the French Revolution is becoming much more radicalized than the American Revolution, right? The American Revolution is primarily primarily political. This is going to be social and is going to do things like, for example, bringing in universal male suffrage, something the Americans had not yet done, right? In America, in this early period, there is a property requirement for voting. Now, you might be saying, well, great. Well, this French Revolution, this is much better than the American Revolution. But there's a couple problems. So even though the French Revolution will dedicate itself to liberty and equality, and that sounds great, the rights that are promised are not really given. Instead, in the name of fraternity, typically in the name of unity, in the name of revolution, those rights are taken from you if you do not agree with the government. So even though on paper you will be given certain political rights, the rights in practice will not actually be recognized. They will be denied you, for example, if you're considered a counter-revolutionary. So, for example, freedom of speech, you don't get it if you support the king once the king is overthrown. That is denied you if you disagree with the revolution. And that is a key point, right? And this is one thing that kind of weakens us. It doesn't seem to me to be much of a political right if you can only exercise it when you agree with the government. More often, I don't believe there is a single instance of universal male suffrage actually being accepted in practice. The results of elections were frequently ignored or overturned if those results were not what the government wanted. And the basic idea here is that there's this understanding that in the name of the revolution, you can ignore people's political rights, you could ignore elections and things like that. So on paper, this stuff looks really good, right? All men get the right to vote. I mean, we need to add women, but at least we're moving in the right direction. Okay, everyone's free, everyone's equal. Well, in practice, this is often ignored, and the people's right to cast a vote. I mean, sure, you can cast a vote, but the election might be overturned if the revolutionary government does not like it. And things will become even more radical and violent. Not only is the king overthrown, he will be executed in 1793. And you can see a picture of him on the right, or actually, in a sense, two images of him. If you look to the left of the guillotine, you can see his body. About 10 feet away, you can see his head, right? They've been separated, and the king is dead. And in tradition, they used to say the king is dead, long live the king, meaning the new king. Not in this case, right? There's not going to be king of France for a while after this. Not only do the radicals execute the king, they see the Catholic Church as a source of superstition, and the Catholic Church had traditionally worked closely with the king. It was Catholicism was the official religion of France, so there was an attempt to take over the Catholic Church. And then the revolutionaries said, well, why even keep the Catholic Church around? Let's just replace it with our own religion. And they tried to build their own religion, the worship of reason, basically. If you resisted this, or you were deemed not sufficiently supportive, you could be jailed or executed with or without trial. There were plenty of what were called extrajudicial killings, where people were just killed for not or were just killed without any kind of trial. Now, this is what's key is here. It's not only if you resist the revolution that you can be jailed or executed. People who don't support it sufficiently can be jailed or executed. And this will go to extremes, especially under a man named Robespierre, because he would argue that, that person's not happy enough, right? We just issued a revolutionary edict that is making these important changes, and that person does not look happy enough. He or she must be a secret enemy of the revolution. And as a secret enemy of the revolution, that person has no rights, so they are just going to be executed straight away. So here was the thing. If you were accused of being a revolutionary or an enemy of the revolution, a counter-revolutionary, that was enough to get you in trouble. You weren't really given permission to provide witnesses or evidence to defend yourself. You may not even get a trial. And I want to stress, this wasn't simply for people who resisted. These were people who were not deemed sufficiently supportive of the current revolutionary government. So even if you thought that the king should have been gotten rid of, even if you liked the republic, if you didn't support the current revolutionary government, that was enough to get you executed without trial. And the man that this is most associated with is a man named Robespierre. And Robespierre was convinced that France was full of secret enemies, people who were either counter-revolutionaries or who didn't support the revolution enough, and they needed to be purged. They need to be gotten rid of, executed, so a republic of virtue could be established. And the key thing was under Robespierre, he claimed he had this almost like supernatural ability to detect counter-revolutionaries, and therefore they couldn't do things like support evidence or provide evidence to prove they weren't counter-revolutionaries. And as counter-revolutionaries, they don't have rights, so you can, execute them straight away with basically a fake trial, show trial, or without any trial whatsoever. And Robespierre is key to the launching of what's called the Terror, which executed within just a few years about 40,000 people. And I like to point out, people are often critical of like the Spanish Inquisition, and I think we should be critical of the Spanish Inquisition, but it killed about 10,000 people over several centuries, whereas this kind of secular violence killed more than 40,000 in just a few years, right? So, and one reason they developed the guillotine was it was just simply a more efficient, supposedly more humane way of executing counter-revolutionaries. But we can see how this revolution is kind of going off the rails. It started off being about liberty and equality, but it's now become this kind of radical undertaking where people can be killed, not simply for being counter-revolutionaries, but for not supporting the government enough. And one thing I specialize in is religion and violence. And sometimes when I tell people I specialize in that, they'll say, oh yes, more people have been killed in the name of God than anything else. And I'm like, well, I don't know how you would measure that. But also it's important to understand people were killed for secular reasons. And one thing I like to point out, the French Revolution, the revolutionaries understood themselves as acting in accordance with enlightenment, with rationality. They argued that Catholicism was a superstition, so it needed to be gotten rid of. And they did that by what you can see on the right. Those are Catholic priests being hacked to death, kind of extrajudicial killings. They were just arrested. They haven't been put on trial actually yet. But some people say, let's just get rid of them now, right? These guys are Catholic priests. They're by definition guilty by their identity as priests. On the left, you can see a group of Catholic nuns about ready to be guillotined. Their crime was being Catholic nuns. And like I said, and this wasn't just religious people this happened to, but in this kind of enlightened violence that argued that they were going to rule and according to reason, they found plenty of reasons to justify killing people, including priests and nuns. So it's important to kind of keep this in mind that people are quite good at justifying violence either through religious or secular means. So how did all this end, right? How does the French Revolution end? And it's key to focus on a person named Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte was a successful general, very good soldier in the French army, served the revolution. But one thing was the French government did not have a lot of money, and it did not take care of the army very well. Napoleon was placed in charge of the army in Italy. France had invaded Italy. It actually managed to capture the Pope for a time. And the army in Italy was just not supplied by France, didn't receive much money from France, and the soldiers in that army were really suffering a lot because of that. Now, Napoleon was appointed to be in charge of that army, and one thing he did was he started taking care of that army. He made sure the soldiers were well paid, were well supplied, and that made them loyal to him and not their government. And if you took History 121 and you're thinking of Gaius Marius and Julius Caesar and the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the empire, you are right to do so because this is like totally the same thing, right? You have a successful general whose soldiers become more loyal to him than to the government. That's exactly what happens. And Napoleon Bonaparte will use the army to seize power, and he will end the revolution by becoming emperor. And this is why, when we compare these revolutions, the American Revolution certainly had problems. And like I said, maintaining slavery is a huge problem. It's really wrong. But it's fascinating, that being said, the fact that the American Revolution did not become a dictatorship is astounding, right? That's what everyone kind of predicted, was that you would have a republic for a while, but then it would be too weak and a dictator would come about and seize power. But fortunately, because of people like George Washington, we did not have that happen. We did not have this kind of dictatorship. In France, because things went really crazy and went really radical, and you had people like Robespierre killing people left and right, eventually people said, we would like to have some order and some stability. We don't want this anymore. And that will lead to Napoleon Bonaparte becoming popular among many French people, right? He's not simply a military dictator who rules because he has an army. A lot of people support him because he brings order. And while he'll go back on the freedom granted in the French Revolution, which wasn't that big of a loss in a sense because they didn't really have it, it wasn't really given, he will keep the equality before the law. So Napoleon will change the law to make it equal. In the past, there were different crimes based on your social status. So if you were like an aristocrat and you like killed a peasant, it wasn't that big of a deal. But if you were like a peasant who killed an aristocrat, you would get in a lot of trouble. He made it equal. All people are equal before the law. So he did do that, and he developed a law code based on Enlightenment ideas of what should be done. That law code has not only influenced Europe to this day, it also influenced places like Turkey and certain African countries. So he played an important role in that sense. But the French Revolution essentially ends when he seizes power, and it shows this kind of problem that republics face. Right? The American Revolution, despite its problems, did succeed in bringing about a republic. The French Revolution, in part because it was so radical, failed to do so. And it led instead to dictatorship and empire. Now, in the end, Napoleon will be defeated, go into exile, and France will then later have another king, but that's a story for some time else. The key thing here is now, in a sense, the French Revolution is over, and kills a lot of people, and it shows us, in a sense, when we compare it to the American Revolution, the difficulties when you get so radical and the difficulties in actually establishing a working republic.